This is the Wizard, WZRD Chicago, 88.3 FM. We have with us at Wizard today David Masciotra, the author of I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters. Hello, David. How are you today? And
I'm
did I
doing.
pronounce and did I pronounce your name correctly?
You were close. It's Masciotra.
Masciotra. Masciotra. Okay.
I've heard far worse, and thank you for having me today. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
It's such a your book is I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters is such an insightful work, and it shows how much of a visionary uh, Reverend Jackson is. I was able to read a couple of excerpts from the book this morning on my show, and we're dedicating this show to the underdog and to the Reverend Jackson.
Well, that's fantastic. I wish I would have heard those excerpts. Thank you for doing that. And I know that Reverend Jackson would appreciate you dedicating the program to the underdog. He himself was an underdog, growing up poor, Black in the Jim Crow South. And in fighting for himself, he's also fought for the underdog of all races, all creeds, all genders throughout his life.
Yes, yes. And actually, we do have recording of the show, so that the entire show will be published, and I'll make sure that we send the link to you.
Oh, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, what about Reverend Jackson inspired you to write about him and not some other civil rights figure?
It's slightly personal and slightly political. So beginning with going in reverse order, beginning with the political, as a former student of political science and as a political journalist and polemicist, it's my contention, and I argue it quite forcefully in the book, I Am Somebody, that Reverend Jesse Jackson is the most consequential living civil rights leader in the country. So for that reason, he makes a fine subject for a book. Now, as far as the personal aspect of this, when I was in third grade, my mother gave me a children's biography of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I was swept away by the courage, the heroism, and the love of Martin Luther King's life. But then, of course, quite disturbed and saddened by the ending of the book, which was his assassination. So I asked my mother about that. And in order to try to make me feel better, my mother explained that there were people, some of whom worked with Dr. King, still dedicated to the advancement of King's mission and the preservation of his legacy. And she emphasized Jesse Jackson. And part of that reason was because I grew up in the south suburbs of Chicago, and Jackson's headquarters, of course, is right here in Chicago. So from when I was a little boy, I was very interested in Jesse Jackson.
Mm-hmm. And how did you seal the deal with Reverend Jackson to write? How did you seal the deal with Reverend Jackson to write I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters?
Oh, well, the book, I spent 6 years conducting interviews with Jesse Jackson, and I accompanied him on some travels, and I observed his work up close in the role of journalist to prepare to write this book. However, when I first met Reverend Jackson, it was to conduct an interview on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of his first presidential campaign in 1984. And the intention was only to write a single article for the Daily Beast. And that article is available. Anyone could look it up if you want to see how this whole thing started. And it was a true blessing and thrill of my life that, you can't plan this stuff. Reverend Jackson and I developed a great rapport. and we enjoyed talking to one another. And he invited me back to interview him again, which I did. And it just developed a momentum of its own. So while Reverend Jackson he's endorsed this book saying, I was so moved by this. He said it's the best and most thorough thing ever written about his work. But it's not an official endorsement in the sense that we didn't write it together. He made himself open and available to the process, but I wrote it entirely independently. But I'm very pleased to report that he's pleased with it. And as far as that conversation goes, so much of those 6 years ends up in this book, and the readers can read Jackson's insights, his stories, his reflections on everything from working with Dr. King in the 1960s to his presidential campaigns in the 80s to his current work here in Chicago and around the world on civil rights and voting rights and poverty relief and social justice and so many issues that are essential to America's future and to the world.
The report that you described that you developed with him, with the Reverend Jackson, is very reminiscent of the report that the Reverend Jackson developed with Martin Luther King in the Jr. in the beginning. It sounds, I read about that and it was so touching. And then now I hear this.
Oh, thank you very much for saying that. Yeah, part of the exhilarating mystery of all of our lives is that friendships can form without any plotting or planning. Mm-hmm. So when I entered into Reverend Jackson's office for the first time in 2014, I felt in a certain sense like I was going to see Moses because, I looked at him, and I still look at him this way, as a towering figure of history. But sometimes when we learn of people's lives through newspaper reports or documentaries or history books, we tend to erase their humanity. They become larger than life. And what I learned is that Reverend Jackson has such a profound sense of humanity. He's contrary to the criticism that's often levied against him. He's not a man with a dominant ego. When I sat down with him in his office, before we started the interview, he asked me where I was from. He asked me about my parents. He asked me if I was married. He's a person who he can talk with the best of them, of course, but he's a person who's interested in listening as much as talking. And that's one of the reasons why we got along so well, and we continue to do so.
When I went through your book, I could sense that and how you wrote about the Reverend Jackson. So that's why we dedicated a couple of songs that derive and were about humanity and friendship for our show today. So you'll listen to that when I send you the link for the show.
Oh, thank you. I look forward to it.
You wrote, quote, Jackson's life is not only an instructive rear view mirror, but also a roadmap, unquote. So how are Americans following this roadmap? And does Reverend Jackson feel frustrated about not enough people following this roadmap?
That's an interesting question. And I appreciate you highlighting that statement in the book. Of course, Jesse Jackson's life gives us a rear view mirror because he's a rare figure whose life maps the intersection between biography and history. He lived history, he made history, but in the work that he's continuing to do and in the lessons we can draw from the work that he has done, we do have a roadmap into the future. And it's a roadmap that is probably best captured in one of the slogans he used in his presidential campaign, in which he said, we must leave the racial battleground to find economic common ground and together reach for moral higher ground. And he said we could go forward by hope or backward by fear. Reverend Jackson ends every speech he gives with the words, keep hope alive. I see the substance of that hope. I see the evidence of that hope. You know, last year at this time, we had 20 million Americans fill the streets of all races, of all generations, of all genders, of all sexual orientations, and of all religious beliefs, because a Black man, George Floyd, was murdered. That's a big deal. 2/3 of Americans, according to all the polls, supported the marches after Floyd's murder. Martin Luther King never reached those numbers of support. Reverend Jackson was the first presidential candidate to make part of his campaign support for gay rights. Now we have legalized gay marriage, legalized adoption for gay parents, employment discrimination laws protecting gays and trans people against unlawful firing and harassment on the job. Those are two big examples. We have the Affordable Care Act. It's not Medicare for all. It's not quite what we'd like, but we're getting there. We have in the discussion now tuition-free public university and community college. We're talking about raising the minimum wage to a living wage. So many of the issues that Jackson advocated in the 80s that were considered radical, like subsidized childcare, like a major infrastructure policy, are now part of the mainstream conversation. And simultaneous with that conversation, we've come together in ways that was only a dream in the 60s and the 70s. Now, that being said, of course, Jesse Jackson and other civil rights leaders lament this rise of a fascist, racist movement in the United States, what we saw so ugly on January 6th. Of course, they bemoan, as they should, the rise of voter suppression tactics in Georgia and states across the country to try to keep people, especially people of color, especially poor people, especially students, from voting. We have gun violence, and we have the growth of income inequality. Income inequality is far worse than it was in the 80s and the 90s. So on those issues, we have to keep on fighting, keep on voting, keep on marching. And that's what Jackson's trying to do. One of the things we saw with what happened following Floyd's murder and the guilty verdict for Chauvin, and 28 states and the city of Washington, D.C. enacting police reform laws, is the power of activism. Democracy is not a spectator sport. You have to get in the street. You have to remain committed to making forward momentum and progress on the issues of socio-political consequence. And that is really the main lesson of Reverend Jackson's life and his continual efforts, the activation of democracy and citizenship power, without which the corporate sector, the autocrats, the neo-fascists will continue to prevail. We as the people offer the best check and balance against those forces. And that's what Jackson tries to distill with the I am somebody message and mission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the roadmap that you're talking about, and of his work, and how he was a trailblazer in leading others to follow and continue in this work.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. In fact, Jackson uses that phrase. He says some of us are trailblazers, some of us are pathfinders. So I'll give you a great example of that. When Jackson ran for president I'll give you two examples. When Jackson ran for president in the 80s, Barack Obama, as a college student, watched that campaign and supported that campaign. And although Jackson didn't get the nomination, in '88, he finished second. And at the time, it was the closest second place finish in American primary history. But Barack Obama recalls saying to himself, one day this could happen. We will have a Black president. Well, of course, one day it did happen when he won. So Jackson blazed a trail, and Obama would later find that path. Another great example of that is when Jackson worked with King in the 60s. Of course, their biggest achievements were the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. The main beneficiaries of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were, of course, Black Americans. But it's interesting, women, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, students, gay Americans, and disabled Americans have all cited the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act in their cases against laws discriminating wrongfully and cruelly against them. So that's another case of blazing a trail and then others find the path. So if we all work toward social justice, economic justice, human rights, civil rights, and voting rights, we don't know who will benefit from that work in subsequent years. As Jackson once said, you plant seeds, the trees will grow, and you don't know who in future generations will either pick the fruit from those trees or sit underneath those trees and find shade on a hot day. So we all try to do our best. We all try to activate the belief that if you want a better world, it starts with you. And we can all hope that future generations will benefit from that work.
So does Reverend Jackson feel frustrated sometimes because you've been close to him about not enough people following this roadmap?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, Jackson has registered more Americans to vote than any living figure right now, but we still have relatively low turnout numbers. I mean, in the 2020 presidential election, for example, we broke records, but we still had over 40% of the voting age population that chose to stay home, not to vote. Apathy is one of the great enemies of progress in the United States. And of course, Jackson is frustrated at the amount of people who are not focused on issues of poverty, who are not focused on issues of healthcare and education and workers' rights and voters' rights. And that's why he remains so dedicated to those causes at the age of 79, and even with some health difficulties. For those of you who don't know, he has Parkinson's disease. So he's still courageously and valiantly trying to spread the word and trying to activate people's interest in these issues. And of course it's frustrating. Of course it's frustrating, but it's also very important to maintain a hopeful outlook, because without that hopeful outlook, how will we find the fuel to keep on moving? We'll just get lost in despair.
Yes, there's still so much work for him to do, so he just can't stop. Is there any American figure now following this roadmap?
Oh yeah, we see it. That's the thing. When Jackson ran for the presidency in the 1980s, his campaign was really a full-fledged program and agenda of social democracy. Universal health care, universal child care, free higher education. And at the time, as I said earlier, in the 1980s, those positions were on the margins of the Democratic Party. Now we have figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other members of the so-called squad. We have Elizabeth Warren. We have Bernie Sanders. We even have President Joe Biden, who was at the time in the 80s and the 90s a conservative Democrat, now talking about and enacting an agenda of social democracy, workers' rights, doubling the child tax care credit, a massive infrastructure program. So the Jackson vision of Democratic Party politics is prevailing. We also have what I referred to earlier, the largest social protest movement in American history, which was Black Lives Matter and continues to be Black Lives Matter. That's the Jackson agenda. That's the Jackson agenda. You know, the name of Jackson's organization here in Chicago is the Rainbow Coalition. And what that means is Americans of all races and all ethnicities, all sexual orientations and genders working together for economic justice, for human rights. And that's what we saw last year at this time, when we saw young Americans, Asians, Latinos, whites, blacks, gay, straight, trans, young and old, rich and poor, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, atheist, all working together side by side. That is the vision that Jackson imagined in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and that he's still working to make real now. And although there are certainly many reasons for despair, the Republican Party has become totally insane and hateful. These voter suppression laws, the growth of poverty in the United States, gun violence, there's many reasons for despair, but everything else that I'm describing should give us reason for hope and should give us encouragement and incentive to continue to work toward a more perfect union, to continue to work toward what Walt Whitman called in his poetry, a country that is center for equal sons, center for equal daughters.
Which other civil rights leaders' purpose and work most closely aligns with that of Reverend Jackson now?
You know, I think we see it all over the country. I mean, there's the people that Reverend Jackson worked alongside, such as the Reverend Andrew Young, but we also see it in people like Spike Moss and James McAfee. They are civil rights leaders in Minneapolis, and they've been working for decades on all of the issues that, of course, exploded into visibility with the George Floyd murder. We see it with someone like Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who is so thoroughly dedicated to voters' rights and voting rights. Jackson was on the voting rights cause in the 60s and has never relented. We see it when Reverend Al Sharpton is often the first on the scene after an incident of police brutality. Sharpton, of course, cites Jackson as a mentor and as an inspiration. We see it in the Poor People's Campaign with Reverend William Barber in the Carolinas, working to bring poor people of all races and religions together to fight for better wages, to fight for better benefits, to fight for union rights. Those are issues on which Jackson has dedicated himself for many years. So we see it all over the country. Those are just a few of the sterling examples of what Jackson and others advocated in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, becoming reality and beginning to gain traction and exert influence in the mainstream of the Democratic Party, the mainstream of American political discourse, and our culture. and our culture. You know, I have to say, in addition to writing, I've written this book, I've written other books, I'm a writer for Salon. I also teach at Indiana University Northwest and the University of St. Francis. And my students are, you know, they're sensitive to issues of racial injustice. They're sensitive to issues of homophobia. They're sensitive to issues of anti-Asian or anti-Native American or anti-Latino or anti-immigrant bias or hostility in ways that older generations certainly were not sensitive. So we see the signs of progress all around us. That's not a reason for complacency, but that's a reason for renewed dedication and aggression.
Did all the individuals that you mentioned, does the Reverend Jackson work with them? Is he in contact with them? Do they work together?
Yes, he's quite close with Reverend William Barber, and Jackson has gone down to Barber's Moral Mondays events and spoken many times prior to COVID, of course, pre-pandemic. Jackson and Sharpton are in regular communication. You might have seen Jackson and Sharpton together at the press conference following the conviction on all 3 counts of Derek Chauvin. Jackson and Stacey Abrams have met many times and have maintained a conversation. So, yeah, I think that, you know, every Democrat who ran for president in 2020 personally met with Jackson and applied, to use that term loosely, for his endorsement. The mayor of Minneapolis, after Floyd's murder, the first request he put in for a meeting outside his local circle was with Reverend Jesse Jackson. Jackson recently worked with Lori Lightfoot, mayor of Chicago, to get polling places inside jails, because what many people don't realize is jail inmates who've not yet been convicted of a crime can still vote. So Jackson is saying, get the polling places inside the jails so they can exercise their right to the franchise. Lori Lightfoot made those arrangements. So even though we might not see Reverend Jesse Jackson on television as much as we did in the 80s, the 90s, or even the early 2000s, he is still very much part of this ongoing conversation and ongoing movement for racial justice and economic justice and racial equality in the United States. And that's one reason why I learned so much from my 6 years of interviews with Jackson when I wrote I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters, and why I'm confident that anyone who will read the book will learn so much, not only about history, but about the fights that continue in 2021 and beyond.
When you mentioned that Reverend Jackson worked with Lori Lightfoot to put polling places in the jails, did Reverend Jackson approach other mayors, of the previous mayors, with the same idea?
That's something that he pledged and promised to do every year since 1965. Jackson has spent Christmas morning in Cook County Jail. And that's another issue, by the way. You asked earlier about where we can chart and measure the progress. Think about how in the 80s and 90s, this tough on crime mentality was dominant in our politics. And now we're talking about mass incarceration, and in some states, even fighting against it. This Jackson's effort with Lori Lightfoot was pre-pandemic. So I'm sure it's something he's going to pick up with other mayors now that we're, I hope, beginning to return more to a normal routine. but COVID-19 really slowed that effort down because so much of municipal governance shifted toward dealing with the pandemic, as it should have. But unfortunately, some important issues went to the wayside because we were trying to deal with testing and mitigation and social distancing and then eventually vaccination and all of those efforts that were so crucial to making us a healthy and safe society.
Well, what I actually meant was whether Reverend Jackson approached our previous mayors, such as Rahm Emanuel and Richard J. Daley, about putting polling places
Oh,
inside the jails.
Oh, okay, I understand. I'm sorry that I
That's okay.
misunderstood.
That's okay.
Yes, Jackson was on that cause beginning in the 80s. And as one could gather from the timeline, Daley and Emanuel wouldn't give it the time of day. Lori Lightfoot was receptive to it and she made it happen. Part of that is because she comes out of a civil rights background. Part of that is because perhaps as a Black woman, she's more sensitive to that cause. And also that shows the power of voting and the necessity of voting. Jesse Jackson calls voting a militant apparatus. And I'm a man of the left, as if anyone couldn't tell. But one of the frustrations that Jackson has with the left, and I share it, is that people have a tendency to, if not dismiss, at least downplay the power of the vote. Voting alone isn't sufficient to win the battles we need to win in this country. Sustained activism is what's necessary, but voting is a crucial and critical part of that. And that example that we're talking about right now is one of many illustrations of the power of the vote. Rahm Emanuel was not interested in voting rights. He was not interested in civil rights. He didn't give a damn about people in jail having the right to vote. Lori Lightfoot did, and the only reason that she's mayor right now and someone like Emanuel is not mayor is because a critical mass of people in Chicago came out to vote for her. And therefore on that issue, and I hope on others, we've made some improvements.
This is the Wizard, WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. We have with us David Masciotra, the author of I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters. Getting back to the, you kind of anticipated my question.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, a lot of Reverend Jackson's work is against the status quo. It is so hard to shift or even shift a little bit of the status quo. But when you mention how the critical mass of voters actually changing the people in power so that they are able to shift policy, that's part of the answer to my question that was going to be to you. What was is there any point in history where this shift happened? Because you described a lot of policy changes, etc., that came from Jesse Jackson's trailblazing. But is there any one point where it was crucial that something happened in order for all this progress? It is progress, even though there's a lot of work to do. But is there any one point, or has all this change just been gradual?
Martin Luther King, in his I Have a Dream speech, warned against what he called the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. So profoundly eloquent. And, he was saying that we need big change right now. We don't want to have slow, steady change. However, King as a brilliant man, understood, just as we understand now, that most change does come gradually. So if we take a look at civil rights and racial equality, when Dr. King gave that speech, John Kennedy was president. John Kennedy was a little slow to come around to the civil rights cause, but once he did, he oversaw the very first civil rights measures for Black Americans against employment discrimination and for protecting voting rights as president. Then in his last televised address from the Oval Office, he proposed what became the Civil Rights Act. Tragically, his assassination, of course, prevented him from signing that bill, but his vice president, who then became president, Lyndon Johnson, signed the bill. Lyndon Johnson also signed the Voting Rights Act. So we've seen change come, but we've tended to see it happen gradually. And the problem is that becomes frustrating for people. And I understand that. If you're dealing with extreme poverty in the world's wealthiest nation right now, gradual change doesn't help you put food on the table. Gradual change doesn't help you get your insulin if you're diabetic and you can't afford it. Gradual change doesn't help you if your child is drinking lead poisoned water in a city like Flint, Michigan, or East Chicago, Illinois, or excuse me, East Chicago, Indiana. So I understand the frustration of some of my fellow leftists who want big change and want it right now. But in the words of Reverend Jesse Jackson, when we talked about this, he said, think about where we've come. He put it quite eloquently. He said, sometimes you get so focused and fixated on the distance you have left to climb that you forget to look over your shoulder and see how far you've already come. And he said, think about what we have. We went from essentially, we went from Jim Crow and the terror and tyranny against Black Americans in the South to, as Jackson said, hands that once picked cotton can now pick presidents, can now pick governors, can now pick mayors. We went from we went from the no protections for people being discriminated against in the workplace to EEOC and a whole host of non-discrimination laws. We went from no environmental movement to speak of to now we have an EPA, and now we have a climate change czar, using the word loosely, in the White House. So we have seen the country change so much for the better. And people who know this better than anyone are the right wingers, because the right wingers wouldn't try to keep people from voting. They wouldn't suppress the vote. They wouldn't have right now 30 bills in states across the country to try to penalize and punish and prevent protest if they didn't understand that the country is changing for the better and that they're on the wrong side of history. That's what Make America Great Again, stressing the word again, was all about. It was, let's go back to what the country was like before Black people were becoming mayors and senators and presidents. Let's go back to what the country was like before people were talking about better programs and more rights for the poor. Let's go back to what the country was like before gay marriage. Let's go back to what the country was like before we had a rainbow coalition in the streets demanding racial justice, demanding economic justice. Let's go back to what the country was like when it was a white supremacist male-dominated quasi-democracy. They don't want full-fledged democracy. We're trying to move into the activation of finally a multiracial, multicultural, ecumenical democracy. And that's the battle. That's where we stand right now. It'll be the most important question as we move into the election of 2022, the election of 2024, and as we see this battle play out from the power in the streets against the corporate boardrooms. That's the most important question that we have.
Perfect lead into my next question. What are some of Reverend Jackson's victories for economic integration into a discriminatory economy?
That's a good question. In the 1970s, well, beginning in the late 60s, and I write about this in I Am Somebody in great detail, Jackson founded the Chicago chapter of an organization called Operation Breadbasket. The situation on the ground in Chicago was that white business owners typically refused to hire Black workers in anything other than menial positions. White controlled banks refused to give business startup loans to Blacks, regardless of qualifications. And trade unions refused to admit Black workers, again, regardless of qualifications. So we had a racist economy in which it was almost impossible. There were always great exceptions, but almost impossible for anyone non-white, particularly Black people, to matriculate into the middle class. So what Operation Breadbasket, and then when Jackson founded Operation Push did, was leverage the consumer power of Blacks, Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, and sympathetic and supportive white progressives into forcing white-owned and white-managed companies into hiring Black workers, placing Black products on their shelves, pressuring banks into giving loans to Black applicants, and pressuring trade unions to admit Black workers. The result was thousands of Black people gained employment positions, and there was millions of dollars in ancillary benefits for Black entrepreneurs, Black workers, Black families, and so on and so forth. And in Chicago became the epicenter of Black economics. So in Chicago, you had, after the Tulsa riots, that's a whole nother story, the first Black-owned banks, you had the first Black PR companies, you had Ebony and Jet magazine, and you had all of this Black economic activity, and that eventually went national. So Jackson began to operate, and Operation Push, no pun intended, began to operate as this roving bodyguard to ensure that companies, both small and multinational corporations, were fair and equitable to Black workers and Black consumers. And that continues to this day because Jackson and the Rainbow Push Coalition were the first on the case in Silicon Valley. Companies like Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, Google, they have Blacks over-indexed as consumers and users, but almost no Blacks on their board of directors, almost no Black executives. And what Rainbow Push Coalition did is they bought shares in these companies so they could go to the shareholder meetings and advocate for better workplace and hiring practices. Now, simultaneously, Jackson and the Rainbow Push Coalition have been major supporters of the labor movement and major supporters of change at the policy level so as to ensure that we have a more equitable economy and a more equitable arrangement of resources across the board. But Operation Push and Operation Breadbasket, in the words of one civil rights historian, the dean of the history department at Middlebury University, is the most important but underrated story of the civil rights movement in American history. And that's something that we're seeing now. So now people are quite sensitive to what are major corporations doing in terms of their hiring practices and policies, in terms of their investments. Are they bringing the full polity of American society, including Blacks, into the picture, into the conversation, and more especially into leadership positions? So that's why many corporations, and many of them, of course, are totally insincere, but why they're advertising that they support Black Lives Matter, why they always use interracial couples in commercials. That's because people have become sensitive to those issues. And they weren't sensitive to those issues in the 60s and 70s. Operation Push, Operation Breadbasket collectively was a major part in creating that sensitivity, and more consequentially, creating the actions that have produced some of the changes that we're now observing and measuring.
Did Operation Push donate to political campaigns for candidates that share Operation Push's goals and visions?
Reverend Jackson personally endorses candidates. They also opened their doors for candidates to speak to their supporters and volunteers. Mm-hmm. The Rainbow Push Coalition, however, does not tend.
Yeah, it's a nonprofit. It can't.
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's a nonprofit organization, they cannot, as an organization, endorse candidates.
I see. Has Reverend Jackson ever mentioned to you who among his fellow change makers most clearly shares his vision of the I Enterprise?
That's an interesting question. I think there's many people, and Reverend, there's many people, including the names I mentioned earlier, William Barber, and many activists and leaders, Sharpton to a certain extent. Jackson has had a close friendship with Bernie Sanders since the 1980s. Bernie Sanders was the first white public official to endorse Jackson's candidacy for the presidency, and Jackson returned the favor by endorsing the Sanders campaign in 2020, a great speech in Michigan. So there's many people. There's many young figures who are very much in debt to Jackson and who acknowledge that debt. Everyone from Mayor Pete Buttigieg to Alana Presley in Ohio to Lori Lightfoot, as I said, the current mayor of Chicago. I think it's also important to say, these are all names that the public recognizes, but with every civil rights organization, there are unsung heroes. And if you go to Rainbow Push right here in Chicago, you can meet people like Betty Magnus, Alana Ford, John Mitchell, John Adams, and I know I'm leaving out some wonderful people who are very much dedicated to the cause. These are highly intelligent, educated, courageous people who operate without public acclaim, who operate without applause, but they are essential to the inner workings of that organization, and therefore they are essential to the achievements of that organization. And no matter the issue you consider most important, Maybe you're an environmentalist, so you're a major supporter of earth justice or the Sunrise Movement or Greenpeace. Maybe you're a major supporter of criminal justice reform, so you're involved in one of those organizations. There are people hard at work trying to make this country a more free and fair society who, because they're just working in an office or because they're volunteers, they're not getting the applause and the acclaim. But it's very important that we remember those people. Betty Magnus, for example, she's worked with Reverend Jackson since the early 1980s. And, she gets up and she goes to work every day, working on voting rights, working on combating gun violence, and working on many other issues. And yet, most people don't know her name, but she's someone whose name everyone should know. So it's important to talk about those people too.
Yes. When you wrote about Reverend Jackson imploring the audience at the Selma Convention Center 50-year remembrance of Bloody Sunday in Selma, you concluded with a prayer which Reverend Jackson said for cancer patient and remembrance attendee Lisa. Does Reverend Jackson write all of his speeches and his other oratory?
For a long time, he would only use notes and would mainly speak extemporaneously. However, for some of the more major addresses, like the two speeches he gave at the Democratic National Conventions in '84 and '88, he would typically co-write these speeches. So there's a man named Frank Watkins who I interviewed for the book, and he's someone else who I should have included in my answer just a moment ago, who's worked alongside Jackson without acclaim for decades. He and Jackson would write speeches together, but he typically, either writes these speeches himself or does so with a co-writer.
Mhm. One of Reverend Jackson's goals seems to be coalescing Black people's and white people's benefits from what he is advocating. Has Reverend Jackson been successful in this goal?
To a certain extent, yes. America is such a contradictory country. Ralph Ellison, one of our great novelists in our history, he wrote Invisible Man. And I have a book called Barack Obama, Invisible Man, which uses the Ralph Ellison novel as kind of a means to analyze Obama's political career. Ralph Ellison said that history functions as a boomerang. Sometimes you throw it out and it looks like it's making progress and then it springs back. And that's what we live with. So in some ways, Jackson's effort to try to fight against the divide and conquer tactic by bringing white workers and Black workers, the white poor and the Black poor, the white middle class and the Black middle class together to advocate for their common interest. In some ways that's been successful, while in other ways we've seen the country fracture. I think we could, obviously everyone wouldn't agree, but many of us would agree that the Trump presidency, for example, was a terrible fracturing of our society, tearing people apart. Trump acting as this demagogue, playing on racial divisions and encouraging hatred. I mean, what a horror show, what a nightmare those 4 years. So that was an example of the boomerang coming back and, hitting some of us in the face. But now I think that we're all feeling more hopeful. Michael Lewis, one of America's best journalists, said just a few years ago that we're living in this terrible anti-government, anti-social era. And he said it would take something like a pandemic to end this era, because it would take something in which we're all at risk. And of course, some will suffer more than others, namely the poor, but that we all suffer. Of course, Michael Lewis wasn't hoping that a pandemic would occur. but it did, and it has emphasized that we're all sharing the world, as cliched as that sounds. And, you know, if we're in a pandemic and your neighbor doesn't have access to good health care, it's no longer a question just of your neighbor's health, because if your neighbor gets sick and he doesn't have access to good health care, he's putting you at risk. If we're in a society where we have terrible income inequality, and we recognize that for so long in our country, great public schools built the middle class, great unions built the middle class, maybe we can begin to realize that the poor child living across town who isn't getting a good education, it's not only bad for him and his family, but it's bad for our entire community, because that's a child who has less of a chance of growing up to become a great civil rights attorney, or a great entrepreneur, or a great artist, or a great journalist, or a great doctor. And therefore, we're all poor as a result. So one of the things we're beginning to see happen with the most diverse and progressive House of Representatives in this country's history, with President Biden, and with this new conversation, is we're beginning to think about what are the ways in which we're all connected. And to return to Jackson's language, what are the ways that we can leave the racial battleground to find economic common ground and reach for moral higher ground? You know, whether you're Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, gay, straight, whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, whether you're young, whether you're old, you need a living wage. If you have a child, you want that child to get a good education. You need access to medicine if you're sick, or treatment if you're injured. You want to live in an environment where the air isn't polluted, the air is clean, the water supply is clean. You know, climate change threatens all of us. So if we don't begin to have, we have begun to have that conversation, but if we don't continue it, and if we don't see it manifest with public policies that reorient our society, then we're going to unfortunately suffer what Jackson predicts. When Jackson has said, he said throughout his life, we can live together as brothers and sisters, or perish together as fools. COVID taught us that we can perish together as fools. Climate change is teaching us we can perish together as fools. Gun violence is teaching us that we can perish together as fools. So we have to learn how to live together as brothers and sisters. And we have to not just do so idealistically, but make it a reality in our political system and our legal system.
Who is Reverend Jackson's main white supporter now, would you say?
Well, you know, we could talk about one of those unsung heroes like Frank Watkins. He's worked alongside Jackson and with the Rainbow Push Coalition for 50 years. If we want to talk about politics, we can get into Senator Bernie Sanders, who since the 80s has cited Reverend Jackson as one of his biggest influences and one of his heroes. We can talk about writers, you know, we can talk about, in my book, I think that, excuse me, as self-indulgent as it might seem, I'm a white writer, and I'm doing everything I can to get Jackson's story and Jackson's mission and message out into public discourse. So there are many people. Marshall Frady, who's now deceased, wrote a wonderful biography of Jackson published in the early 90s. Santita Jackson, Reverend's daughter, who has a radio show here in Chicago, often talks about how it's interesting that Reverend Jackson finds a way to get these crucial white supporters, like Bernie Sanders, who's white and Jewish, like Frank Watkins, and like many others. So there's a good group out there, and I'm happy to be part of it.
Who is Reverend Jackson's main Black supporter now?
Well, again, we could talk about members of his staff, someone like Alana Ford or Betty Magnus or Jeanette Wilson or Todd Yeary, who often do such critical work behind the scenes. But in terms of an elected official, Vice President Kamala Harris, for example, she was a volunteer on the Jackson campaigns in the 80s. And when she recently visited Chicago, she personally met with Reverend Jackson. Mayor Lori Lightfoot continues to draw on Jackson's counsel. Jackson just recently met with the newly appointed Illinois Speaker of the House. So there are officials scattered across the country, and there are people out of power, political power, but who are very influential, like Reverend William Barber, who continue to either support what Jackson is doing or draw on Jackson to support what they're doing. And that's part of what works so well about having a democratic culture in which there are many people committed to activism and organization and public advocacy, is that those activists and those organizers can fill in each other's gaps. So there are people who are more committed, for example, to rectifying the climate crisis than Rainbow Push. Rainbow Push is mainly involved in other issues, but Rainbow Push can support the efforts of those other organizations that are working on the climate crisis. And likewise, those organizations working on the climate crisis aren't as focused on voting rights as the Rainbow Push Coalition, but they can lend a hand and support those efforts. So there's this almost musical rhythm that can develop.
You did mention in your book that the Reverend Jackson is very good at organization, and that's a major part of his success. How deeply is Reverend Jackson involved in the business side of Rainbow Push?
Jackson is the director of it, so he makes the ultimate decisions. He often decides with what projects the organization will get involved. So for example, right now, Rainbow Push Coalition is advocating on behalf of the tenants at a public housing complex on the south side of Chicago, Concordia apartments. The people who live there are living in such foul and filthy conditions. There's rodent infestation, there's mold in the walls, there's appliances that don't work. I mean, it really is just a hideous injustice. And Jackson has gotten Push involved in that cause. They've gotten HUD to agree to perform inspections, and they're really applying pressure to the private company that manages these apartments to start treating these human beings with the dignity and respect that they deserve. So that Jackson has a committed staff around him that handle much of the logistics, and of course handle much of the communication, and they will sometimes bring Jackson a project and he will approve or veto it. But also often Jackson, who's a voracious follower of the news and is very much involved in many different issues, will champion the cause for which they get involved. So it's an interesting organization with an interesting dynamic, and many passionate, intelligent people hard at work.
What is Reverend Jackson's main frustration now compared to 50 years ago?
He's talked about this, and it's he draws on it in one of the conversations we had for the book. Jackson admits that when the civil rights movement, he and Dr. King and Andrew Young and many others, when they won the right to vote, they were naive. He uses that word because they didn't understand. They thought, now we have the right to vote, so we can begin to exercise the franchise and make improvements. And in many ways that happened. He's not denying that it happened. But they were naive to voter suppression. They were naive, and again, naive's his word, to gerrymandering. They were naive to stacking and packing districts. So when you draw the districts up, you make sure that all the Black voters are in one district so as to minimize their voting power in a state. They were naive to things like what prohibiting felons from voting and then writing laws so more Black people go to jail than white people. For example, white people use drugs at higher rates than Black people. All the studies confirm that, yet Black people are arrested at higher rates for drug offenses and convicted at higher rates and imprisoned at higher rates. What that would do to nullify voting and dilute the power of the franchise. So his biggest frustration right now that he's expressed to me is voter suppression. Is the nullification of voter power. So just because everyone has the right to vote doesn't mean that everyone has equal opportunity to use the right to vote. And that's what we're seeing in Georgia right now with that awful law that was just passed, really a resurrection of Jim Crow, making it illegal, for example, to even give a voter a bottle of water while he or she's waiting in line. I mean, these kind of measures that too often, now it's more on the radar, but for many years, were under the radar. So we can lament, of course, we can mourn the victory of Trump in 2016. Voter suppression was a major part of that story. In the state of Wisconsin, for example, the Republicans passed many voter suppression laws, making it harder for college students to vote, making it harder for poor people to vote, disproportionately Black and Native American. Trump won that state by only 15,000 votes. Many studies show that over 100,000 votes were suppressed. So this is a story that continues to develop. Biden won Georgia, and we all celebrated, as we should. Biden won the state of Georgia by 20,000 votes. Prior to the election, 200,000 voters, almost all of whom were Black, were unlawfully purged from the voter rolls. Greg Palast, a great investigative journalist, is on this story, and the NAACP is going to file a lawsuit against the state of Georgia. So had those 200,000 voters not been purged, the overwhelming majority of them would have voted for Biden, and Biden would have won the state by maybe 200,000 votes instead of 20,000 votes. Biden lost the state of Florida by, I think, something like 50,000 votes. Florida has all kinds of voter suppression laws. Florida moved polling places off of college campuses. In the state of Texas, they have a voter ID law. You can vote with a gun, with a concealed carry ID, but you can't vote with a student ID. So we all know what the results of that will be, because students tend to vote Democrat, gun owners tend to vote Republican. And Republican officials, by the way, often brag about what they're doing. After 2016, Republican officials in the state of North Carolina boasted publicly that their voter suppression laws lowered Black turnout by 10%. In Wisconsin, Republican officials boasted that they lowered Black turnout. Donald Trump once said that if the Democrats succeed in passing the voting laws they want to pass, Republicans might not win another presidential election. So Republicans have begun to realize that they offer nothing to the American people, nothing on health care, nothing on poverty, nothing on climate change, nothing on gun violence. So therefore, and the demographics are turning against them. Young Americans are more democratic. Black Americans, Latino Americans, all these growing populations are turning against them. So therefore, their only way to win nationally is to stop people from voting and to undermine and undercut democracy. Can they succeed? Well, they're certainly trying. Like I said, 30 states are making it harder for people to protest. Georgia's not the only state passing voter suppression rules and regulations. So that's Jackson's biggest frustration today, that he's a man who has devoted his life to the universal franchise, to full-fledged democracy, and they thought that they were winning that victory in the 60s and 70s, but the Republicans turned out to be quite creative and clever for finding new ways to undercut and undermine democracy, and that's the new fight and frustration.
What does Reverend Jackson feel is his most significant accomplishment over these past 50 years?
That's interesting. You know, I asked him something similar once, and he didn't name just one accomplishment. He talked about something we haven't discussed today, but I spend a lot of time on it in the book. He talked about his international work, you know, going around the world and negotiating the release of hostages and political prisoners. He talked about changing the situation on the ground in Cuba to make religious freedom a possibility underneath Castro's leadership. He talked about some of the things that we discussed earlier on voting rights and the universal franchise. He talked about his presidential campaigns, which really reshaped the demography and ideology of the Democratic Party. And out of his presidential campaigns, figures like Paul Wellstone and Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris and Beto O'Rourke emerged onto the American scene. You know what, I closed the book with, if I can read it, these are the final words of the book, with a speech, part of a speech he gave on July 4th, December 2015. And he gave this speech at the Rainbow Push Coalition. Before the pandemic, Rainbow Push would meet every Saturday morning for the Saturday Morning Forum. And when it's safe, they're going to begin to do so again. So I hope that your Chicago area listeners will attend some of those meetings. But the Rainbow Push Choir was singing a song called Testimony. And Jackson said, Rosa Parks had a testimony. Martin Luther King had a testimony. Nelson Mandela had a testimony. And then he began to give his own testimony, and he said, I once was young, but now I'm old. I've seen loss, bitterness, meanness. But when I look back over my life, there's power, there's joy, there's hope, there's healing. So those are beautiful words. And, you know, Jackson has seen more tragedy, more trauma than the average person. You know, he was at the scene when Dr. King was murdered. He has seen so many killings like what happened to George Floyd. He's visited the poorest parts of our country. And he's seen the white poor in Appalachia. He's spoken to them. He's seen the inner city poor in cities like Chicago and Milwaukee and Detroit. He has visited Native American reservations and seen the poverty and deprivation that exists there. He's visited the border towns and seen Latino immigrants fighting for a better life, working in the fields. Jackson worked alongside Cesar Chavez. So he has seen hardship and heartache and injustice and oppression. But for him to say that he's also seen joy and power and hope and healing gives us such a beautiful and profound lesson that we too can endure, and we too can measure the promise of what we can achieve in our own lives and what we can achieve when we work together.
Thank you so much, David Masciotra, the author of I Am Somebody, Why Jesse Jackson Matters. This has been such a great interview, and we really appreciate your being with us today on WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Are we off the air?